Guys, this is Ashley Kang of Horizon Esports. This interview has been brought to you by Republic of Gamers, by Strict Scars G18, and I am joined by Chronicler.
Big fan,
Oh, big fan
Ashley.
too. The caster at 2020 MSI here at Chengdu, China. Hi, Chronicler. How have you been doing? How is Chengdu
It's
so
been really
far for
fun.
you?
I actually went and saw the pandas yesterday, which is something everyone agrees you have to do. Red pandas were my favorite. It was really cute. Also, food here was amazing, which shouldn't come as a surprise. I had a really good time because I love spicy food. So then I think you're generally pretty set here. And the tournament's been, I think, very different from what a lot of people, including me, were expecting. So it's been really fun to see all the ups and downs of all the different teams so far.
We currently have four teams remaining, which is T1, Genji, BLG, and G2. When you say you are quite surprised that it didn't meet your expectation, can you tell me more in detail?
So specifically, the fact that G2 has made it the furthest, I think, isn't that surprising because G2 was generally considered coming in the strongest team of the West. I think it's mainly the way in which the T1 G2 series played out and the way that the G2 TES series played out. I think both were coming into the tournament, definitely not what I was expecting. So specifically G2, because I think in the past they've had a lot of tournaments where it feels like their read on draft is great. I think their staff in general does a really good job with punishing the biggest weakness that a lot of Eastern teams, including LCK teams, have, which is very predictable drafting. Right? I think LCK teams are and LPL teams are obviously really strong, but they are very much the tier list pick. But the big difference for me is that G2 also is able to match in terms of gameplay. And I feel like last year that just wasn't really the case. So that has been one of the big standouts. And then secondly, the fact that TES them losing, I could have seen coming in, right? But them getting 3-0'd was, I think, a really, really big surprise. I think Genji's performance has been a little better than expected. I think with Genji, given how the last couple of years have played out, you're always a little worried when it comes to international performance. But I do think that, the TS series was a little spooky, but it ended up working out. I think BLG probably still looking like the strongest team, but obviously whether or not they're actually going to be, we're going to see in I don't know, what is it, like 45 minutes? I'm going to be casting that, and I'm very nervous for my team. So hopefully that ends well.
Like speaking of Genji in particular, because they'll be also, as you mentioned, playing soon against BLG. Yeah, I would also agree with you that Genji didn't look like the most solid team that we would expect of them in their test series, but I also saw a lot of positives for them. Like for example, Game 5 felt clutch, especially from Keen and Canyon. Like, this is the clutch vector that someone who has been following Genji would be hoping and dreaming for. Can you tell me more about this? You seem to be agreeing based on your facial
Yeah,
expressions.
yeah. Obviously, we've had a fair share of conversations regarding Genji and their struggles over the last 2 years, and I do think that even though Keen, I really want to sing his praises. I think Canyon, the game five was great, but even in the game five, he made some pretty pivotal mistakes. And then additionally, game three and four, he was also not having the best of times. But it really does feel like that to me, and I was saying this coming out of the series as well, a really, really important series for Genji to win, even if they don't end up, even if they end up losing the BLG today, even if they don't make it to the final somehow. Because for me, one of the big things that this team has struggled with over the last 2 years, as you've been saying, is specifically the fact that they can clutch it out when they really get pushed. And now the back-to-back 5 games against T1 in the finals of LCK, and then them winning this, I think is a really big sign that this team is going to be a little bit different than the Genji that we saw. I don't know if that's just me coping too hard because they did also, got brought to game five by TES, who then got 3-0. But I don't think that really, it doesn't really work that way. PSG bringing BLG to five, also in the grand scheme of things, I don't think means that much. I think it's the same for G2 or for Genji rather.
I also think that we also need to put into account just how much the lane swap meta has been impacting the different teams. I didn't expect this to be such a game changer. And the team's individual performance also seemed to be heavily dependent on how much they're used to the current meta, the lane swaps, the really, really chaotic, like, lane rotations and things like that.
Yeah, particularly T1, right? Like that's the big story coming in, and has been the big story of MSI, even though they did beat TL. Coming into tomorrow's series, I think most people's sentiment, I would agree, is that G2 are the favorites. I don't think that it's necessarily really heavy favorites. But it definitely feels with the way that T1 have been so dominant, it's been relying on players themselves. I think I've said that as well, which I'm sure you know, is that specifically the top half of the map and the bottom half of the map, they've just always had pushing lanes. Those lanes play very aggressively. They play for winning the matchup. And we saw the punish, for example, last year. Shun did a really good job of that, but it is also what has made them such a threatening team, and the fact that lane swaps throw all that off, even if the lane swap doesn't actually come through, which we've seen in a lot of games, right? G2, I think, haven't actually. I don't know if they've barely lane swapped, basically, even though they were the ones that brought it out initially. But the threat of lane swap alone, I think, really changes how drafts are done. And T1 in particular have really struggled with it. Whereas I think Gen G actually seems to have a really good grasp of it, which makes sense because they generally are seen as more of a smart team as opposed to a team that kind of, just punches your face in the way that BLG most notably or T1 in recent years did as well.
Like, I do want to touch up G2 a bit more because I really agree with your earlier statement. You know, Western teams, G2 especially, have at times pushed specific games to their favor, and they were always also known to draft picks that weren't necessarily conventional, especially in LCK and LPL. And this is something that we do also see from G2, but it also feels like there is like a Korean word for raw stamina or the raw level of the players. They just seem to be able to match that when it comes when they're facing against Asian teams too. Where do you think this change has happened? How does G2 seem different from the previous international tournaments, especially this iteration of G2?
So the short version is I think Caps is just playing way better than he was last year. I think Caps last year had a pretty rough year internationally. Obviously, domestically, G2 still the number one team pretty easily. But that is one thing. Caps actually looking way better. I think G2 also keeping the lineup together helped with them really being all in together on winning. LEC is enough. We need to actually make a big splash outside of that. I also think at this point, even if they do end up losing like a close series to T1 tomorrow, which again, I think that matchup is still pretty close, although T1 have really been struggling in this meta. But even if they end up losing a close series, it doesn't really take away from the fact that when it comes to pure gameplay, they're actually able to match up. And obviously, they're put in a really good position by their coaching staff consistently, which helps with execution. And I think that one of the few games where we saw that the execution was still a little bit below par was the game 5 versus T1. I really favored G2's draft coming into that one. And then they made a couple of mistakes, overchased in mid, and then Faker was still able to clutch it out. If they remove those levels of mistakes, though, particularly against T1, I think T1 is going to have a really hard time because at their best, they've been able to really push the meta forward. We saw that last year at Worlds. If they don't, right now it seems like G2 is very much at the forefront with things like the Poppy, the Ivern as well, and particularly with how formulaic a lot of T1's drafts in particular are. I think that they're going to get punished really heavily if they don't really delve deep in their champion pools and in their approach to the game and shake up draft. Because if you draft as expected with the level that G2 is playing right now, I don't know if T1's going to be able to beat them.
Have we actually seen that before? Like right now, if you tell me about T1's draft, I know that they're gonna have high priority on Senna. I know that Zeus is going to play something a bit more aggressive and possibly also have Yone always in his back pocket. I know that Baker's gonna be that solid person in the mid lane, playing often mages and owner like Sincha or Lee Sin. Do you think that given what you know of T1, they can pivot in 48 hours?
Yeah, for sure. That wouldn't be the first time that T1 has made. It is a really short turnaround time, but even I think it's important to note that in the last LCK playoffs this spring, after they were beaten by Hanwha like pretty mercilessly, right? There was a 3-1, but it didn't look like they were on the same page. The team didn't look that good. That was a little bit of a longer turnaround, but there was still not that much time between those two series. And this team has also been together for a really long time. My main issue isn't necessarily just with their meta read, because I think that's more easily fixable, but it feels like they are a lot more disjointed than they have been in a long time. And it's especially interesting because it comes after a really good domestic split, right? They were very, very strong throughout the entirety of spring. Faker in particular, individually was really, really strong. And he's not really been able to replicate that. His laning stats have really taken a nosedive, where in the LCK, he was getting beaten by Chovy, but that's kind of an yeah, it's kind of an everyone in the world problem. But outside of that, he was very far ahead, I think, of Zeka, of BDD, of Showmaker. So I think it's partially Faker dropping off. I think it's partially the lane swap meta throwing them off. And as a result, the rest of T1 doesn't seem to really be able to play to the same level. And because the rest of them aren't able, Guma notwithstanding, I think he's had a standout tournament. Because of the fact that they aren't really stepping up, it's also easier to punish Faker, who has to play a lot more aggressive. So it's kind of a chain reaction. Can they fix all that? I think history has told us yes. Will they? I don't know. I think T1 also have been grinding nonstop for like, what is it, the last, like they started qualifying in 2022, right? Which was 2 years ago. They've made it to every single international final, barring last year at MSI when they got third or fourth. I forgot. They got knocked out by BLG, and I think it was the losers bracket.
I think it was the third
So
because Genji lost
yeah,
to
it
BLG
was the
first,
losers
and
bracket.
then it was
Yeah,
T1
you're right.
losing to yeah.
So they've been part of, and then also they have a lot of off-season tournaments. So I don't think that it would be shocking if that finally catches up with them. They've been able to kind of stay ahead of that, but eventually I think the type of schedule is going to take its toll.
We kind of naturally, in the progression of conversation, ended up covering Genji, T1 and G2. I think it's, you know, I think it's pretty good to also give some love to BLG and give some basic analysis on it because BLG has been powerhouse on international tournaments, especially in MSI for a while. But I just think that the addition of Knight have given them an extra carry threat and just enabled the team one step further. And I just think that the individual players on that team are really good. Like everyone's talking about Soon, and I just think that we can't sing enough praises about the LK and On duo. But how would you overall rate the playstyle of BLG? Why would you consider them favorites right now?
So there's two elements to it. One is that it seems like BLG is not too bothered by the current shift in the meta. I think that they have shown that they're able to either deal with lane swaps or play around them in a way that doesn't really hamstring them the way that we've seen with T1, which is interesting because BLG is also an aggressive team. They love playing very early on. I think particularly the early levels of Bin and Elkin On were something that made them a breakout star last year as well, right? Because I think coming into MSI last year, a lot of people were pretty down, although I might have been thrown off by Emily Rand, who is a really big LPL fan, but sometimes, which I have a tendency to do as well, is like, no, this team has so many errors. That was me with 2022 DRX, and we all know how that one ended. But for BLG specifically, I feel like the meta shift hasn't hurt them, and the main thing is that it doesn't feel like there is any member that isn't performing up to par. I think that everyone on BLG, except maybe Knight on control mages, but that's always been kind of a thing for him, right? Like there's a reason why I don't think his Corki and his Zero are really up to par, but he doesn't need to do that. And outside of that, I still think he's had a great tournament. So Alcanon, PSG series notwithstanding, have been amazing. Knight has been amazing. Shun has been amazing. So and Bin as well. So it makes it really hard to find a reliable opening. And I think that at their peak, I do think that Chovy in particular and Canyon are players that are almost impossible to match, but Elk and On should be really far ahead of Pays and Lahens. And that to me is a really big issue. And I think if it doesn't matter if it ends up being T1 or G2 that will eventually face off, right, against BLG or Genji as well, it makes it really hard to formulate a strategy. I think with T1, it's very obvious this tournament. You focus Faker. For Genji, you focus the bot side. For G2, I think that we have seen, although that wasn't the case in the TS series, but their bot lane can be sometimes a little bit of a liability, although in that series they really recuperated. But at least it feels like, and I think sometimes they can kind of get too overexcited when it comes to the things that they draft, and they might not hit the mark. Those all feel like you can go in and you can kind of formulate a plan around that. I think for BLG, to me, it doesn't feel like there is as much of a easily identifiable weakness. And obviously, you know, we're top four in the world. Like all of these teams on a good day can beat all of them. But in the most scenarios, I think BLG, given how they've been playing, should still be the tournament favorite. Good.
This is my final question. It's a bit of a targeted question. Who's the team that first team and the second team that you want to win MSI the most? And what would it mean for each of those teams to win MSI?
Can I just do number one? Because I feel like it makes it so for me, and this should come as a no-brainer, but it really is Genji, specifically because Chovy's domestic performance, it just feels like he keeps getting better every single split, right? Like he keeps further surging and surging ahead. things like the series he found against Hanwha Life in playoffs was just a level of carrying that we haven't seen a whole lot of, because League has become so much more of a team game. So those type of 1v9 performances become much rarer. And then add to that the fact that you have Keen, who also is a player that has such a storied history. Canyon, who was only 2 games away from winning either MSI and or Worlds, right, in 2021, trying to reclaim. I think that that in particular for me is something that I feel really strongly about, because we saw with Knight as well that he was also a player that was talked about very well domestically, but internationally, because he's never won an international title, that wasn't really, people still held that against him very strongly. And I think the MSI win of last year really helped him with that. And for Chovy, I kind of want the same. And obviously, my number 2 would be T1, but they just came off a Worlds win, right? So I feel like they just won Worlds. I feel like those guys, if they don't end up making it, I mean, obviously, I'm the LCK caster, right? Like, I think that particularly for BLG, the redemption story of them not being able to make it last year, even with their breakout, and then getting it is really cool. Knight defending his title, and G2 is self-explanatory. I think it's really good for the game and the ecosystem. But if you ask me where my heart lies, it should not come as a shocking answer.
Yeah, Chovy winning today's series would put him one step closer to winning an international title, because he's never even been to a final.
I know. I'm worried, Ashley. I don't know if it's happening.
I don't know. You hyped it up too much. You cursed
We'll
it. I'm sorry. You cursed it.
What do you mean? I didn't say that we're going to at any point.
You were hoping for it. You were making some positive cases for it. Sorry, and I am really, really appreciative of you making time, joining your busy MSI schedule, and I think people will also appreciate your valuable insight. And best of luck, and break a leg for the rest of the MSI podcast.
Thank you so much, Ashley. It was a great time as always.
Thank you.